podcast is a production of Widener Law Commonwealth in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. For more information, visit commonwealthlaw.widener.edu/podcast. Now here's your host, Julie Sheldon.
Welcome to Widener Law Commonwealth's podcast. I'm here today with Associate Professor of Legal Methods, David Raker Jordan. He is going to talk to us about evidence-based study tips. Thanks for coming.
Certainly.
So we can jump right in, and let's start with, how do most students study in college?
Unfortunately, the most popular way that students study in college is they simply reread. They either reread the textbook or they reread their notes from class. And while that may be sufficient to get you a decent grade in undergrad, if that's the only study skill you really have, you're probably going to have some problems once you get to law school.
Can students study for law school the same way? I mean, I think you kind of indicated that that's not going to work for them. So what are some of the different ways that we can explain to them that they would be better able to study?
So, well, to start with, the problem with rereading is that it's very passive. So once you've read something the first time, the evidence shows, research shows that you're going to glean about as much as you can from that first reading. And when you go back and you reread it again, you recognize the material that you reread, but you don't understand it. And it doesn't really help your understanding that much to reread. Invariably what happens, though, is students, as they reread, they recognize the material and they mix up the difference between understanding the material and recognizing the material. So typically when people reread, they recognize the material, but that doesn't actually help them. Some people in college do more than that, and they study in a way that's a lot more active. So for law students, you need to be actively engaged with the material, which means you can't just go back and reread. And there's a number of what I would call evidence-based study tips, ways of studying that we've got gobs and gobs of research that indicates that it's helpful. 3 of those, the most popular ones, in my opinion, would be what scientists refer to as retrieval, spaced repetition, and interleaving.
Okay. I'm going to ask you probably about each one of those in this podcast. So
that was my plan.
Okay, excellent. Good. We're all on the same page then. So what is retrieval practice? What is that?
So retrieval is just a kind of fancy word for just bringing to the front of your mind what you've already learned. So it's any scenario where you're remembering what you learned. So instead of, let's say you draft a case brief for class, you could reread the case brief before you go to class, or you could cover up that page. You could only look at the title of the case, and you could ask yourself, what do I remember about this case? What were the key facts? What was the holding? What was the court's policy analysis? That's retrieval. So it's forcing yourself to remember what you've learned so that you can then kind of judge whether you're remembering enough or not. And then once you state everything you remember about that case, you remove the piece of paper, you take a look at your case brief, and you say, oh, I forgot about this. Well, now you're focused just on this one little area that you've forgotten. You're going to reread that, and now it's going to make a much bigger impact. If you just reread the whole thing from top to bottom, you might not even notice that you'd forgotten one particular piece of information until you actually try to retrieve that recollection through retrieval.
Gotcha. And that makes perfect sense. I mean, I know that when I was studying in undergrad and grad school, that was the thing is, you'd want to go back and reread things, but I always felt like I was just starting to skim over things. So that makes perfect sense to just focus on the holes that you may have and then to move forward with that. Can you give us some examples of retrieval practice that we've done?
Sure. So one way you could use that retrieval is the example I just used with a case brief. Another way you could do it is if you know you have a quiz coming up, and you could either create an outline of your class notes, and then you could cover up that outline and maybe start with like a particular tort, maybe false imprisonment. And so with only the words false imprisonment in writing, can you remember all the elements of false imprisonment? Once you've stated those elements, can you remember what those elements mean? Can you bring to mind facts that would implicate each of those elements? So it's starting with a small piece and seeing if you can remember the other pieces of the puzzle that surround that. Kind of the way this will work at the end of the semester with an outline is maybe you have like a 50-page outline for a particular course. And the recommendation a lot of times we tell students is you need to take that outline and you need to boil it down. You need to boil it down to a skinny, so maybe like a 3-page outline. Well, what's going to happen is when you look at each of the phrases or sentences in that mini outline, you should be able to retrieve all the information in your big outline. So when you look at just like a couple words, you'll be able to remember what was in your original outline. Maybe it was like a whole page of explanation. So that by the time you actually get ready for an exam and you sit down, there's a number of keywords that you need to remember. Once you have those keywords, you can drill down into each of those and remember all the pieces that go underneath that. That's a really good way to use retrieval. Some students will use retrieval with flashcards. Mm-hmm. So maybe you put the concept on one side of the flashcard and the definition on the other. And you just go through the flashcard, you look at the concept, and can you define it? You define it out loud, you define it in your head, you flip the flashcard over, and you immediately know whether you know it or you don't know it. If you don't know it, put it in one pile, so you're going to repeat that. If you do know it, maybe put it in a different pile, maybe you repeat that next week. You don't need to repeat it right now because you already know it, but over time you're going to tend to forget it. So a lot of different ways you can use retrieval. The law library just recently got subscriptions to study aids.
Okay.
You could go into the study aids. You could find multiple choice questions that deal with a topic that you just covered in civil procedure. And then without looking at your notes, you could start to go through those multiple choice questions and see if you can answer them. If you can't answer it, you need to figure out why you missed that. Now go back to your notes or go back to your outline and refresh that material so that you can remember what you've forgotten or what you didn't learn. Maybe there's something you weren't paying attention to in class. So a lot of simple ways to use retrieval to build a stronger memory of all the law that you're going to need and also the way that you need to use that law to solve real problems.
And now, can we talk a little bit about spaced repetition? What is spaced repetition?
So spaced repetition is probably easiest to understand when you contrast it with the other method, which is cramming. So most students in undergrad a lot of us would wait until the last minute, the night before the exam, and we'd sit down and we'd cram. And cramming, the evidence shows that cramming can work if you have enough time and the material is not too difficult, and you mainly just need to regurgitate something that you memorized. In that situation, cramming can work.
So no long-term retention possibilities? Really?
No.
Okay.
No, you're not going to have long-term. Part of the problem with the human brain is that unlike a filing cabinet where you put something in, it's there forever, as soon as we start to learn something, we're going to start to forget it. And so spaced repetition is built on that fact that we know you're going to forget it. So let's say you're going to learn it on one particular week and you don't have an exam until week 10. You need to come back and periodically review that material so that you build a strong recollection of it. If you just wait until week 9.5, all you're going to do is you're going to cram that material in. You might know a good bit of it for the exam, but particularly in law school where we don't just ask you to regurgitate, memorize information, you need to use that information to actually solve a real problem. That's not enough time to be able to cram it into your head in a way that you can structure you can structure it in your head to be able to use it to solve real problems. So spaced repetition would say, learn something, then let's wait a few days, wait about a week, come back and take a look at it again and relearn it. Then you can wait maybe 2 weeks, come back and take a look at it again. So instead of saying, I'm going to study for this exam for 10 hours the night before, maybe you study for 2 hours in a week, you wait a couple weeks to spend another 2 hours, you wait maybe 3 weeks to spend another 2 hours. By the time you get to the exam, you're going to have a much stronger recollection. That memory is going to stay with you longer. And in fact, it might even be the case that when you sit down and study for the bar exam, you actually remember some things you learned as a first year.
Can you give us some examples of spaced repetition?
Spaced repetition, yeah, I think so. Some of the research would indicate that, let's say you sit down, you go to class, you take your notes. Mm-hmm. At the end of that day, or within 24 hours of that class, you should go back and take another look at those notes for two reasons. One, to refresh your recollection about what happened in class. But the other, and for me sometimes this is a little bit separate from spaced repetition, but in your head you're going to remember things that happened in class that you didn't write down in your notes. You need to put those things in your notes, because 3 or 4 days from now, you will not remember what happened in class, and it will not be recorded in your notes. So getting everything in your notes is going to be important. Then at some point, maybe at the end of a particular chapter or a particular concept, you're going to take those notes and you're going to take a look at them again, you're going to reread them, and you're going to turn them into an outline. So there's some spaced repetition there. You're going to use, if you then use that outline maybe the week after that to work through some multiple choice problems, you're now refreshing your recollection, you're working on your memory to see if you can retrieve that information, but you're doing it a couple weeks from when you actually learned it. So periodically going back and relearning the material by working through questions or reviewing your outline are all examples of spaced repetition. I know in our first year classes, we do have a number of classes where students are getting assessed with multiple choice questions. For the most part, professors don't make those quizzes cumulative, although there are a couple professors who are making them cumulative, and I think more are going to start doing that. And in part, it's to force this spaced repetition so that you don't just learn the material in week 1 of the class, take a quiz in week 3, and then forget about it till the very end. Mm-hmm. But in week 5, when you have another quiz, you have to go back and look at the material from the first week. So that's forcing students to go back and use spaced repetition. They're going to remember the material better. It's more work right now, but they'll remember it better when it comes for the final exam.
Now, you've mentioned outlining a couple of different times with both of these techniques that we've talked about so far. Are there different techniques for outlining? Are there different ways to teach a student how to outline more effectively or efficiently? Or is that a personal type of study habit?
Outlining it's a very personal thing. People outline in different ways. Some people just use note cards, just use flashcards. Some people use kind of a traditional outlining method with Roman numerals. I've seen other people make a flow chart as the basis of their outlining. The key, though, is the outline is the way that you take all this individual material and individual facts and cases that you learned in class, and you put it into an organizational structure that you understand and that you can then use to solve real problems. You're not going to have a law school exam that says, explain what negligent infliction of emotional distress means. Right. It's not going to happen. Instead, you'll have a fact pattern that implicates negligent infliction of emotional distress, but that phrase will never show up anywhere in the question a lot of times. And the call to the question will just be, discuss whatever action A can take against B. And you need to spot negligent infliction. So as part of an outline, you're certainly going to have all the rules in there and all the elements, but you also are going to need to have what a lot of us refer to as trigger facts. So what are the facts that are generally associated with this particular element or typically associated with this particular cause of action? So that when you see facts like that, it triggers your recollection to say, this might be negligent infliction of emotional distress. Let me run through the elements to see if that's present there. So I think I've looked at a lot of outlines, a lot of times with first-year students. They have all the rules in there, but they don't have a lot of trigger facts. They don't have a lot of hypotheticals. And so if I ask them, can you tell me all the elements of negligent infliction of emotional distress, they can do it. But if I give them a problem that implicates it, they may or may not spot it. And that's because although they're memorizing the rules, they don't understand how the rules work in the real world. The application. And so the outline needs to do both. It needs to have everything that you need to memorize, but it also needs to indicate to you how you're going to work a problem like this. How do you attack a problem like this? What do you start with? What do you end with? What do you need to have memorized? What kind of things are going to change? What facts should you be looking for?
Okay. And now moving on to kind of the last one, the third one. What is interleaving?
So interleaving that's the third study tip. It's the one that's the most counterintuitive. So interleaving is, I guess, what I would contrast it with would be blocked practice. So a lot of times if the students have like a couple exams coming up, they'll spend the whole time studying for one exam until they feel like they have that solid before they move on to the second exam. And interleaving, the research indicates that when you have two topics that are different but related, that you actually learn better if you study a little bit of one and then a little bit of the other. Now, students don't like this because they feel like, okay, I just started studying torts. I'm just starting to get a little bit of understanding about
That's
negligence.
me. I get one track mind and I get into it, and then I don't want to change.
That's the way most of us are. We want to feel like we're an expert in one area before we move to another. But interleaving, the research indicates that if you study a little bit of this one particular area till you kind of are decent at it but not great, and then you move to a related area that's different, it actually will help you to learn both of them better. One of the examples that I saw that I thought was really a powerful example was it was in an art history class. So there were two groups of students. One group of students, both groups of students had to learn about Impressionist artists. And so in the first group, they only looked at one artist at a time. So they look at all Monet paintings. And they learned how to spot a Monet painting and what Monet did and how he differed from other people. But they're only looking at Monet paintings. The other one, they mixed different Impressionist artists together. And they had to figure out, was that a Monet? Was that a Renoir? And so it was harder because you had a lot more choices. But what they were able to do was they were able to compare and contrast between the artists, which they couldn't do if they only looked at one artist at a time. And so although the students in the second group who had multiple artists all together felt like it was taking them forever to learn how to do this, when it actually came time to the final exam, it was the students who had interleaved the artists. They were the ones who could identify the paintings much better than the ones who only looked at one artist at a time.
Interesting.
There was another study with little kids with bean bags. So there was a group of kids throwing bean bags into a bucket that was 3 feet away. And that's all they were doing, 3 feet away. There's another group of kids, they were throwing bean bags into one of two buckets. One bucket was 3 feet away. The other was 5 feet away. For the final exam, they had to throw bean bags into a bucket that was 4 feet away. The kids who practiced with the 3 and the 5 were much more accurate because they had to learn to differentiate between the closer bucket and the further bucket, whereas the first group of kids, they just kept doing the same thing over and over. They weren't able to adjust as well. So it may or may not be perfectly analogous to what we do in law school, but there's clearly a lot of concepts in different law school courses that are similar. They get called different things, but I think there's enough commonality between law school courses that if you had like 2 days to study for an exam, maybe you'd be better off to spend half the day on the first exam and the second half of the day on the second exam, and then the next day come back and do the same thing. So don't spend like a whole day in one subject, but see if you can mix it up some. Now, a lot of students aren't going to do that, and I completely understand that. That's not the way any of us studied, I don't think.
No.
But the research indicates that it can be very helpful to break that up. So I guess the bottom line would be if you're studying a particular course and you're getting tired of that and you need a break, sometimes taking a break studying in a different course is going to be actually going to be helpful.
Gotcha. And so kind of a general question, why is learning so hard? Why? I mean, we all know law school is hard, but it seems like learning can be hard. Memorization. I don't want to use memorization. Application of newly learned information, that sort of thing. Learning is hard. One of the things that makes learning easier is if you can take new information and tie it to old information. So that's part of the reason I think certain classes in law school are easier than others. So most people have seen, like Law and Order. They have some familiarity with criminal law. They probably weren't charged themselves, but they know how kind of the criminal law process works. And so when they sit in a criminal law class and they learn that information, they have existing knowledge in their head about how the criminal law system works. They can attach that new knowledge to the old knowledge. Mm-hmm. Whereas a course like civil procedure, which is the rules about how a lawsuit works, there's no CSI civil procedure. There's no law and order. I can't imagine why. There's no law and order civil procedure. It's a brand new area that students have no familiarity with. And so they find it, most of them at least, find it very difficult to learn because they don't have any existing knowledge to attach that to. So that's one thing. The other is that we tend to forget. So as soon as we learn something, if we don't put it into action, if we don't use it, we tend to forget it. Now, you can either sit there and repeat it over and over and over, like the way we used to learn phone numbers back in the old days before we had cell phones.
Or you could use, spaced repetition where you learn it and you realize, okay, I'm going to forget. So I'll come back in a week. I won't remember all of it, but I'll remember a lot of it. And then I'll relearn the stuff that I've forgotten. So it takes a lot of effort to learn things, particularly in an academic setting. And also, especially if it's not really interesting. So, we tend to remember things that are really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you meet somebody who's really interesting and they give you your phone number or you learn their name, you're going to remember that. But a lot of things that we learn in an academic setting just aren't nearly as intrinsically interesting or we don't have the same sort of emotional attachment to that. And so it just takes effort to learn that. I wish it weren't that. I wish, it'd be nice if I could just take all the knowledge I have and just download it to my students and it goes right in their heads.
Like a little USB port?
That would be wonderful.
Yeah.
I think that would really reduce...
And creepy at the same time.
It would be creepy, yes. I think it would seriously reduce the cost of law school. But I don't see that happening anytime soon.
And possibly the length. You just download... Okay.
It would, yes.
So what type of books, flashcards, study aids have you had the best luck with, or would you recommend? Do you have favorites that you like?
I think it really depends on the individual. A lot of people really like flashcards. I was never really a flashcard person, but I think for a lot of students, it's really, really helpful, particularly if you're talking about like an exception to a rule. Most people probably have the rule in their head, but a lot of times it's the exceptions that give them problems, especially if you're talking about a multiple choice test. That's where we tend to look. We'll ask about the exceptions. So flashcards would be really helpful there. In the study aids, in the online study aids, we've got a number of books now with lots of really good multiple choice questions, which I think can be really helpful. We also have a lot of good secondary sources so that if you're looking through your notes and you try to use your notes to answer a multiple choice question and you get it wrong and you realize, okay, my notes aren't very good, you can find a secondary source that's going to explain that topic in more detail than your notes contain. Or sometimes it'll go about explaining a topic in a way different from the way your professor explained it, and all of a sudden now that'll click. So maybe what your professor said didn't stick, but what you read in the secondary source makes a lot more sense, and now you understand it better. So I think you kind of have to just kind of go out into the secondary sources, into the study aids, look around and see what works for you. I've also encouraged students, if they're having problems in a particular class, take a list of the study aids to the professor. Say, Professor, these are the study aids that we have available to us online. Would you recommend any of these study aids? And for a lot of professors, there's a horn book or a treatise that they really like. And if they recommend that, then that would be the one that I would use in that class.
Okay. Do you feel that there's advantages to studying as a group study?
There can be, yeah. So especially with this retrieval practice. So if we're getting ready for an exam and we're studying together, I could say, I'm not really sure I understand all the different things I need to understand about consideration. Let me tell you what I know, and you check me against your notes. So I could then articulate all the different parts of consideration. You could take a look at your notes, and you could say, well, you missed this, or you missed that. There's something about articulating it out loud that helps us to retrieve it better and makes it stick. I tell a lot of students, a study group is great for that, but if you don't have a study group, talk to your dog. Your dog will listen to everything you say. You can explain the rule against perpetuities to your dog. And there's something about saying it out loud that helps your brain to focus on what you're saying and not focus so much on what you think you're saying. So that if you misstate something, it's easier to catch it if you say it out loud. So even if you're just talking in the mirror, you're talking to your dog, all those are legitimate ways to practice retrieval. But a study group can be really helpful in terms of retrieval. It can also be really helpful in terms of working through essay questions. So if you have an essay question and the group takes a look at it, and maybe everybody spends 20 minutes working out kind of how they would outline the answer, and then you get back together and talk about, okay, how would you outline that answer? Sometimes that can be really helpful to give students an idea of all the different ways that you could approach that question to answer it.
So everybody knows that I like to end with a bit of a fun question. Did you have anything else to add before we move on to our fun question for the...
No, we should definitely go to the fun question.
Okay. So the fun question is, what is your favorite fall beverage?
Well, I'm not sure if it's my favorite fall beverage, but I think oatmeal stout, I think is always a good beverage.
It's a hearty beverage.
It's both a beverage and a breakfast
and
item.
A meal, yes.
It's a meal and a beverage. So it kills two birds with one stone. So I think I'll go with that.
It's a wise choice.
And I guess you could serve it warm in cold weather.
For those, because you can't see me, I'm making this terrible face right now.
Well, good stout at room temperature.
I know
delicious.
they serve it at room temperature.
It is delicious if it's good stout.
Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for asking.
Of course. And also to our listeners, please stay tuned for further episodes. And please be sure to go on and leave a review for our podcast. You can even leave a suggested topic if you would like. Thanks so much.
Widener University Commonwealth Law School is the Pennsylvania capital's only law school, with 3 specialized centers of legal scholarship through its Law and Government Institute, Environmental Law and Sustainability Center, and Business Advising Program. Widener Law Commonwealth offers an exceptional learning experience that is personal, practical, and professional. Visit commonwealthlaw.widener.edu for more information.